Welcome back, students. As you may be aware, people refer to marriage sometimes, or the act of being married, as leaving and cleaving. This comes from Genesis, where the man is instructed and the woman is instructed to leave father and mother and to cleave onto, or cling to, or hold on to wife, and wife to hold on to husband. The nature of that is unpacked in chapter 7 of the Baldwick book, which is talking about the leaving and the cleaving and becoming one flesh. All three of those need to take place within marriage. There can be cleaving and becoming one flesh without leaving, which leads to harm within the marriage. What we mean by this is there are those people that never quite leave the nest before they're married, and while they're married, still rely too heavily on their parents. Now, this can be financially, but that's not what I truly mean by that. I mean that connection of I'm my own person now, I'm an adult now, and I need to be most concerned with two things as a married person: loving God and loving my spouse, which is my first neighbor. We're familiar with the Great Commission: love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. The closest neighbor that a married person has is their spouse. Therefore, we need to keep in mind that to say I am cleaving to, or clinging to, or marrying my spouse, I am recognizing now that I have a closest neighbor, closer than any other. And so I must leave. Now, sometimes people don't cleave, and this happens over a period of time, and they don't feel connected. They don't feel intimate, and not just the becoming one flesh. We'll talk about that. And we already have a little bit, but this idea of cleaving, remaining connected, remaining in communication, remaining in concern for one another in a positive way, which then leads to physical expression of that. So this leaving, this cleaving, and this becoming one flesh is so important. I want you to notice one key factor on page 83 before we move any further. And that is, on this page, they talk about the fact that there needs to be levels of differentiation from their parents, but also remaining on page 83, it says, we believe the Trinitarian model of relationality to become one without absorption is God's ideal for marriage. To become one without absorption. What does this mean? Well, let's go back to the Trinity model. You have Father, Son, and Spirit. Christian theology teaches that there's one God, monotheism. There's three within one. Now, it's not modalism as the heresy taught, where you have one God who at times is the Father, who at times is the Son, who at time is the Spirit. This is seen in Genesis, where God is going to later say, let us create. Also says the Spirit is hovering over the deep early in the first chapter. We find this in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was and with, both one without, both one yet still distinctive. We see Jesus being baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist. The heavens open up, the Holy Spirit descends like a dove, and the Father speaks from heaven. So you see the Trinitarian beings, monotheistic God, Father in heaven, Spirit upon Jesus. Modalism says again that God is one at a time. Christian theology, based biblically, is that Father, Son, and Spirit are all one God, but they also coexist as three distinct persons in one unity. Now, that is a mystery we cannot truly fathom, but so is this biblical concept of marriage, that man and woman, husband and wife, come together as one, physically, yes, but more than just that. And they remain two. What's this mean? It means that I cannot try to turn the other person into another me, nor should I want to. I should honor my wife's differences. I should expect there to be differences. I should appreciate them. I should speak positively about them and not try to form the person with whom we spend most time and most to whom we extend most grace and most love when we're doing it well, that we don't absorb them. Two become one without absorption. Later in the page, cleaving, in page 83, it says, what we call romantic love develops over three sequential stages, starting with lust, and they don't mean that by the sin, but the sexual drive, attraction, and finally emotional attachment. As we think about cleaving, also, this idea on page 84, it says he viewed, speaking of Eric Fromm, he viewed love as an art that must be practiced through discipline, concentration, patience, and supreme concern for the other. Romantic love must move from a mushy feeling in the pit of the stomach to an act of commitment, intimacy, and secure bonding. We must move past this mushy feeling. It has to be done. It is essential that it is done, because without moving past this mushiness, then there is no growth, then there is no richness to the marriage. So as they continue to talk about this idea of becoming one flesh, they're going to be talking about the conscious factors and then later the unconscious factors. On the conscious factors, is talking about the way in which we are endogamous and the homogeneous. And the endogamous, I said it incorrectly a minute ago, endogamous factors that draw people together are similar backgrounds like race, ethnicity, religion, education, occupation, and geographic proximity. Basically, people are most likely to be drawn to people like them, same socioeconomic level, same neighborhood, same language, have similar family backgrounds, etc. There's nothing wrong with getting outside that, nor is there anything wrong staying within that. That is the most common. But then the homogenous factors that draw people together are personal characteristics and interests, such as moral values, religion, political values, hobbies, intelligence, height, weight, and physical appearance. People have different standards. People have what they're looking for, and that's okay. The great commandments are to love God and love neighbor, and loving neighbor leaves no room for racism. It leaves no room for excluding people because what they look like, or what language they speak, or what they wear and don't wear, or what socioeconomic level is their norm, or do we agree with them politically? Do we have a shared understanding of how the world is ordered and the values? There's no room for any separation in that sense of the word. But in this marriage relationship, we understand that there are going to be things we're naturally attracted to, similarities and differences, which call us unto that person. And that's okay. But and these are the things we're saying we do consciously. We actually think about this. We think, can I marry somebody who votes differently than I do? We think about that. Can I do this and think about it? That's the question. The unconscious is seen on the next page. They're based on complementary needs. They seem to be an unconscious desire to find qualities in a mate that one does not possess. It's this, we all know that we have limitations. We have things that we are good at and we are not good at. And there's a theory that unconsciously we try to fill in those gaps. Now, there's some wisdom to this, somewhat of the survival of the fittest, a little bit there, that I know if I am a person who doesn't have enough adventure, I want to choose somebody who does. I'm a person who doesn't have enough structure, I want to choose a person that does. And often we don't sit down and think about this. It just happens. And that's their argument here in this text. As we go on, we realize in marriage, as the book is going to say, that it's not just two people that are married. Now, we're not talking about polygamy. We're not talking about open marriages. We're not talking about things where people invite more than one other person into their life. Husband and wife are monogamous and are to keep it that way. Somewhat of a shocking subheading, but for good reason. The Baldwicks are saying there are six in the marriage bed. And what in the world does that mean? We understand this is a book written from a Christian standpoint. So we obviously don't mean six in the bed romantically. What are they talking about? So spouses who have a good relationship with their parents and siblings enter marriage with a fairly clean slate and little emotional baggage to bog them down. Yet no one has a perfect childhood. And family relationship dynamics will become part of every couple encounter. They're they're using sort of tongue in cheek here. You have six. You have husband, father, mother, wife, father, mother, six together. Meaning whether you came from a single family or not, so the number can be different. But the idea that your background is in the marriage with you, to the marriage bed, to the marriage home, to the marriage relationship, that you're not just bringing yourself. I know this from my own experience. I grew up in a home that was very traditional, where my mom chose to primarily be a mom and a housekeeper, or not a housekeeper, a homemaker. And my father was a dentist, and so he went off to work and came home, and he helped here and there on doing some things, but most of the home chores, if you will, were done by my mom. This was not oppression. This was not something my dad said you must do. It was just something they did, as many people did in that generation. When I got married, my wife and I were married, and within a year, we had some conflict, and the conflict was over those very issues because we were both in school at the time and doing some work in various ways. And I brought that into our marriage, thinking, well, this is what my mom did, this is what my dad did, and so that must be how it works out with us. And this was something that really came to a head, if you will, about 6 years later. We dealt with it early on, and then it kind of dealt with itself. And then 6 years later, we had our daughter, our first child, and she was born. And then I'd learned a little bit, but not enough, and so I wasn't helping out enough. And so we've had some good conversation over the years, and thankfully I matured and realized she was right, I was wrong. But all that story to tell you that we bring expectations in marriage that some start in our families. And some of you probably experienced things exactly like this or very similar to this. We all experience to some degree or another. That's important for us to understand. Spouses come together and understand that they are in need of some changes as they develop in these areas of importance, of understanding the value of separation from our families, not in the sense of I have nothing to do with them anymore, but I cherish what I've learned, but I also understand my family's now my family, not my family's family. When we look at this idea, the book talks about the importance of these boundaries. What do boundaries look like? It says if a spouse cleaves to his father, to to his or her family of origin, it can wreak havoc on the marriage. So what do they suggest? They suggest some boundaries that we're going to unpack a little bit. Not to say, here's this wall, you're not climbing it, but a father and a mother recognizing that a son's spouse, a son's wife, or a daughter's husband is that most important relationship now, humanly speaking, not them as a family. And so on page 88, 89, we see an interesting phrase. Back on 88, it says marriage is a stage on which an entire cast of our internal characters performs. So it all plays out in marriage. Bottom of the page. Since each spouse carries family of origin dynamics into marriage, an extreme reaction to one spouse means he or she has most likely triggered something painful in one's childhood experience. Our manager parts function to protect these vulnerable childhood wounds by keeping them at bay and taking charge of things. They put an external front that disguises the underlying pain. Until there's healing of past wounds, however, this disguise will be ineffective. For example, when wounded parts, exiles, emerge, they need to be acknowledged, addressed, understood, and comforted. In marriage, if there is no understanding of these parts, spouses tend to react emotionally with anger, accusation, and blaming, which only escalates misunderstanding, distrust, and distance. There's a very wise take here that we must pull, and that is that while we may not unpack everything in front of our spouse that we've dealt with, then we need to be honest that if something they do or don't do triggers something painful in us, they deserve honesty. They deserve to know why that is instead of just keeping them guessing. That is the point. To recognize that we have to go through a process of healing ourselves as well. The next page talks about a good item for us to think about in this whole topic. It says being aware of the cast of characters in yourself and your partner can provide insight into internal parts that trigger negative or positive responses in the relationship. As one develops a more clearly differentiated self, one learns to soothe and center oneself and so can act in balanced and responsible ways. Being differentiated means one is not only aware of the parts and the extreme reactivity, but is also able to draw on internal resources and calm oneself. By understanding and monitoring the most extreme parts, one learns to lead with a solid differentiated self. I like that solid differentiated self. And we have to know our cast of characters. What are you bringing into the marriage? In other words, it's so important to say. So when we talk about this, we understand since we bring all these characters in that we have roles and talking about parents as role models and then spousal roles and role taking and role playing. And now we're going to talk about this idea of role making. Role making, page 92. Says the role of husband and wife is objectively defined by one's spouse, family, church, community, and society at large. So people have to make their role, and it's going to be highly impacted by what you came out of, as I mentioned before. There's give and take, there's move, there's flex when a marriage is doing well. As it happens, there's going to be role conflict. It says role conflict can become a serious area of disruption in marriage. However, couples who are able to make adaptations by adjusting the fantasy role to a reality-based role will be able to resolve differences quite easily. Goes back to that Larry Link thing I mentioned earlier about the dream and the reality, the fantasy and the reality. Let's take bills, for example. If there's a person who's not good with numbers and she's the wife and she says, my mom always did, I did the money, did the taxes, did the check writing, and did the online accounting. And she herself, however, is not good with numbers. There's no reason for her to be doing the numbers. If there is the man and his dad grew up doing all the cooking in the home, or majority of it, but he himself is a lousy cook, the marriage needs to talk about that and say, well, I think I'm a lousy cook. Should I learn to cook better, or should we share this more, or you just love cooking and you can do it? These are the conversations that need to take place, which leads to this next kind of role they're talking about, and that is role flexibility. And they say it is absolutely necessary. This is important too because life is going to change. As I said, we have 3 kids. Our life is different than it was when we were just the 2 of us up until about 6 years of marriage. In a year and a half, we'll be back to empty nesters. And we're already past the who's driving the kids to school. They're driving their own, or they're married, they live in a different state. We go through different phases. So who drives the car? Who takes the kids? Who goes shopping for the kids? Who goes grocery shopping? Who cooks? Who pays the bills? All these things need to be negotiated. And not in the sense of scratch back, I'll scratch yours if you scratch mine, but the sense of what makes sense most in our relationship. And that is important. I know it's not the next chapter, but I want to skip over. We're going to come back, but I want to skip over to chapter 13 because we've been talking about sexuality is a part of this. And we don't want to get away from that quite yet, because in this, there is a good understanding of the what they call the sexual embers. And listen to this. It says, not long ago, a client blurted out his frustration in the counseling office. Quote, "Can you help us get the passion that we once had back into our marriage?" Ironically, they remembered how hard it was to contain the fiery passion of the early marriage. But after 10 years, the fire had fizzled. Both spouses tried to rekindle the flame in different ways. But Beverly fixed scrumptious dinners with all the romantic accoutrements, candles, china, and crystal, soft music playing in the background to set the mood. She was sure this would set the spark flying, but to her dismay, Chuck didn't pick up on any of it. He had other ideas about how to spice up their sex life with videos he thought would do the trick. Beverly was appalled, leaving him feeling rejected. Things only worsened. They retreated into complacency, accepting a bland sex life. Boredom diminishes sexual embers. Sexual routines become ruts of dissatisfaction. Go on, next paragraph. It says, it goes without saying that every couple experiences a normal ebb and flow of marital passion. However, a lack of sexual desire and involvement should be a warning sign to couples. In a national sample of 6,029 married couples, factors that predicted sexual inactivity were unhappiness with the marital relationship, lack of shared activity, increased age, and poor health. It behooves a couple to pay attention when either spouse experiences decreased interest in sex. This includes checking out medical concerns that could be contributing to the lack of desire, such as hormonal levels, as well as life or relationship stressors that may be contributing to the lack of desire. This is important for people to understand. Again, this is part of the conversation. This is part of the flexibility. Use that word. We're using it in roles earlier. This flexibility. Pastorally here, I want to add one side note, which is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but important. It talks about the things that Beverly and what was his name? Beverly and Chuck did. And Beverly wanted to do the meal and scrumptious and candles, etc. But Chuck wanted to bring in videos. On the videos, I wanted to mention, folks, that pornography has no place in marriage, period. Whether that be video, whether that be magazine, whether that be some sort of other means, it does not belong in marriage. That needs to be stated. It's a big problem in our society, which leads to some other things we'll be talking about, and this is unfaithfulness. Unfaithfulness, when we think of it, we think of adultery, and we're going to talk about that. And it's certainly the main topic of this next section. But people commit adultery without committing adultery. What do I mean by this? Well, for that, to help us understand it, we go back to the book of Matthew, and Jesus is preaching his famous Sermon on the Mount, and he is saying, you've heard it said, but I say, you've heard it said, but I say. And when he gets to this idea of adultery, and he says, you do not commit adultery, he says, but you have done this when you've lusted. And we hear other scriptures talking about this idea that when I lust in my heart, I've committed adultery. And this is a sense that adultery is very damaging, but so is the adultery that takes place in my mind, which can be through pornography. It can be through just turning off the pleasure of the spouse in order to seek own pleasure, even while doing so with spouse, just not being that connected. Well, these kind of things can lead to some disasters. Now, this is an old statistics, 2005, but it says one extensive review. This is in the book of your textbook. It says 175. One extensive review of the infidelity research reports that first 5 years of marriage is especially risky for affairs. In a survey of 3,432 adults, New York sociologists discovered that a married woman likelihood and strain is highest in the first 5 years, while men have two high risk phases, one the first 5 years, another after the 20th year. It's a danger. It's a problem. It's something that needs to be dealt with and to be addressed. That it is something that is an issue in many marriages, unfortunately. It's a marriage, it's an issue in marriage that some do not survive. Many do. A lot of grace, a lot of patience and forgiveness. But in the context of scripture, it recognizes the pain of such betrayal. And therefore, it does say that this is a reason for it's not jump out and get divorced right away. But if they cannot be reconnected, it's a legitimate reason for divorce. But this idea that there are things that can set us up for bad choices is so true. On the next couple pages, it talks about some of those. But I want you to hear this on page 177. It says, one serious caution made by Shirley Glass is that spouses be mindful that proximity in the workplace can be a brewing ground for sexual or emotional affairs because people are drawn close together in a familiar atmosphere and spend many hours a day together. It becomes a viable opportunity for affairs. So one of the risks that we talk about is just spend a lot of time, particularly with the opposite sex, and you must be careful in those contexts. I've shared this story many, many times, but as a young man, I felt called to ministry, and I talked to my pastor about preparing for that academically and spiritually. And one of the first things he told me as I was a young man getting ready to head off to college and later in seminary and just further my pursuit of ministry, he warned me about the topic of women and topic of finance. The exact quote was to keep your hands off the money and keep your hands off the women. Always be aware of that. And because of that, I've set up guidelines and rules throughout my ministry that protect that because no one is above reproach. No one is not susceptible, but all can avoid the situations and all can overcome those if they have the tools set in place. The book talks about any time can be risky for an affair in our sexually charged society where spouses have easy access to get their needs met outside marriage. So people have to be careful. People have to have their heads up. Have to be able to say, you know what? This has happened to people I loved and do love. This has happened in families. This has happened in friends. So it possibly could happen to me. So I'm going to set the guardrails up so that it does not happen to me. Now on page 178 and 179 and over into 180, it talks about reconciliation because many marriages that do have the pain of adultery in them do survive. Doesn't mean the pain goes away, but it means it survived and they work on forgiveness. They work on healing. They work on restoration. And one thing that this book points out here that's so powerful is it says that honesty is the best policy. There's already been dishonesty. There's already been betrayal. And so more betrayal through dishonesty is just going to damage it further. So we look at this whole chapter 13. And we've talked about sexuality. We've talked about communication. We've talked about emotional connection. We've talked about spiritual connection. We've talked about being able to negotiate conflict well together. And then this wonderful summary statement there on page 180 says this: monogamous, lifelong marriage has always been the ideal context for sex. In marital sex, spousal vulnerability reflects God's self-giving grace. The marital relationship is a refining crucible of growth, as well as a comforting container of trust. The two are protected by their covenant commitment and wrapped together in bodily trust. In the depths of emotions and sexual intimacy, each spouse has a sense of well-being in the context of the mysterious one flesh union. This is a good summary, not only of sexual connection, but of emotional connection. People who choose the marriage path need to realize the value of the gift that they have and the gift that they are cherishing. And that is important for all to understand as they are married or as they talk to other people who are married. This will be the end of this lecture for the week. So again, make sure you're staying up with the work assignments. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Also, again, on a pastoral level, if you have anything I can pray for you about, do feel free to email me or to text me. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful evening.